My name is Clara, and when my son stood in my kitchen and told me to leave my own home, the world seemed to tilt the air so thick with betrayal I could barely draw breath. "This is my house now, Mom." Richard said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a shard of glass. He stood tall, arms crossed his frame, filling the doorway while his wife Karen lingered behind him, her lips curled into that thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. I was 68 years old, a widow for nearly a decade, and every inch of this house, every creaking floorboard, every faded curtain held the weight of my life, my love, my sacrifices for him. The walls painted soft yellow when Richard was just a boy seemed to hold their breath waiting for me to speak. But no words came. My hands shook as I clutched the edge of the counter, the same counter where I'd rolled out dough for his birthday cakes, where I'd wiped away his tears after his first heartbreak. I stared down at the worn linoleum, its cracks mapping years of footsteps, and felt something deep within me fracture a quiet breaking no one else could hear. I'd raised Richard on my own after his father, Tom, left us too soon. Tom was my anchor, a man whose hands could mend anything, a dripping faucet, a splintered chair, even the ache in my chest when life pressed too hard. His laughter filled this house deep and warm, and when he died, Richard was just 19, a lanky college freshman with dreams bigger than our small town. I thought we'd carry each other through the grief like two trees leaning together in a storm. To keep him in school, I took on 2 jobs days at the library, shelving books until my shoulders burned, and weekends cleaning houses, scrubbing floors for families who never learned my name. My hands grew rough, my back stooped, but I didn't care. It was for Richard, for his future. Late at night, I'd sit at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow, sewing patches onto his jeans, or tallying every penny in the checkbook to cover his tuition, his books, his chance at something better. He'd call from campus, his voice crackling through the line full of promises. "I'm going to make you proud, Mom," he'd say, and my heart would swell, believing every word. I always believed him. But time has a cruel way of reshaping people, doesn't it? Richard graduated, landed a job in the city, married Karen. They settled an hour away, and the distance between us grew not just in miles, but in silences. I'd set the table for Sunday dinners using my mother's china with its delicate blue flowers, the plates I'd saved for special occasions. I'd roast a chicken, fill the house with the scent of rosemary and warmth, only to get a last-minute call. Karen had a work event, or Richard was too tired. I'd sit alone at the table, the food cooling the empty chairs, staring back at me. I'd tell myself it was fine that they were building their lives, that love doesn't need constant presence. When they did visit, Karen would glide through the house, her heels clicking on the hardwood, her eyes scanning the furniture, the drapes with a faint sneer. "You should really modernize this place, Clara," she'd say, her voice light but edged. "It's so old-fashioned." Richard would chuckle, and I'd force a smile swallowing the sting. I told myself families drift, that they'd find their way back to me. I held on to that hope like a lifeline. Then 2 years ago, their world unraveled and they came back not out of love, but necessity. Richard lost his job, a casualty of some corporate shuffle, and Karen's boutique was drowning in debt. Their mortgage payments loomed like storm clouds, and when Richard called his voice tight with shame, I didn't hesitate. "Come home," I said. "This house is big enough for all of us." It was a 4-bedroom Craftsman, the one Tom and I bought when we were young and foolish, dreaming of a family. We'd paid it off over decades, every mortgage check a small victory, every repair a labor of love. I thought their return would stitch us back together, that we'd find each other again. I gave them the master bedroom with its wide windows and morning light and moved my things to the guest room, its walls bare except for a single photo of Tom and me on our wedding day. I cooked for them pot roasts, lasagna, anything to fill the table with warmth. I folded their laundry, Karen's silk blouses and Richard's pressed shirts, and even planted roses along the front walk because Karen said the yard looked drab. I wanted them to feel at home. I wanted to be needed. But it wasn't the homecoming I dreamed of. Richard barely spoke to me, his eyes glued to his phone, his responses clipped grunts. Karen left dishes piled in the sink, her lipstick staining my favorite mugs, and when I asked if she'd help with chores, she'd laugh a sharp sound that cut. "I'm not your maid, Clara," she said once, her eyes glinting like she'd won something. I began to feel like a shadow in my own home, moving softly, speaking quietly, afraid to disturb the life they were building over mine. I'd escaped to the backyard to the old wooden swing Tom had built. When Richard was small, its ropes weathered but strong. I'd sit there as dusk settled the stars pricking through the sky and ask myself where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too soft with Richard, too quick to forgive? Had I poured so much love into him that I'd left none for myself? The questions hung unanswered heavy as the night air. The worst came a month ago when their voices slipped through the walls, one night low and conspiratorial. I was in bed, the quilt my mother stitched pulled tight around me when I heard Karen's voice clear and cold. "This house is wasted on her," she said. "She's too old to need all this space." Richard's voice followed, steady, agreeing. "She'd be better off in one of those senior homes," he said. "We could do so much with this place." My breath caught my chest tightening as their words sank in. They weren't just staying, they were plotting, weaving a future that erased me. I lay there, the darkness pressing close, and wept for the first time since Tom's funeral. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but silent tears, hot and bitter, the kind that come when you realize no one's coming to hold you. Then came that day in the kitchen, the moment that broke the fragile thread I'd been clinging to. Richard's words. "This is my house," now landed like a verdict final and unyielding. Karen stood behind him, her arms folded, her nod a silent endorsement. I looked at my son, at the boy I'd rocked through fevers whose nightmares I'd chased away, and saw a stranger. His eyes were cold, calculating like I was a puzzle he'd already solved. "You're not well, Mom," he said, his tone softening, rehearsed. "You can't keep up with this place. We're just trying to help." Help. The word tasted like ash. I wanted to scream to tell him this was my home, my sanctuary, the heart of every sacrifice I'd made. But my throat closed, and I turned away, my footsteps heavy as I walked to my room and closed the door. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my hands clasped so tightly, my knuckles ached. The room felt too small, the walls crowding in with memories that both comforted and wounded. There was the dresser Tom had built, its wood smoothed by years of my touch. The photo of Richard at his high school graduation, his grin so bright it could light a room. The quilt my mother made, each stitch a testament to her love. This wasn't just a house, it was my life built through years of quiet endurance, of love given freely, even when it wasn't returned. And they wanted to take it. They wanted to erase me, to write me out of my own story. I don't know how long I sat there, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud, but something stirred inside me. It wasn't rage, not yet, just a faint pulse, like the first tremor of a waking earth. I thought of Tom, his voice steady in my memory, calling me his strength. "You're the backbone, Clara," he'd say, his hand warm over mine, his eyes full of belief. I thought of my mother who'd raised me alone after my father walked away, her spine straight against a world that tried to bend her. I thought of myself, the woman who'd carried on through grief, through exhaustion, through years of giving more than I had. I wasn't ready to be cast aside, not by Richard, not by Karen, not by anyone. The next morning I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. My knees protested as I climbed the attic stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air up there was musty, thick, with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. I found the metal box tucked behind a stack of Tom's old fishing gear, its surface dulled by dust, the lock stubborn, but yielding to my key. Inside was the title deed to the house, my name and Tom's inked in bold black letters, a promise we'd made to each other long ago. I held the paper cool and smooth and felt a spark ignite within me, not loud or fierce, but steady, like a flame that had been smoldering, waiting for its moment. It was power, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that stands quiet and unshakable, ready to reclaim what was mine, that grows from knowing you've earned your place in the world. The attic was dim, the single bulb flickering as I sat on an old trunk, the deed still in my hands. I traced my fingers over Tom's name, the ink faded but resolute like the man himself. For a moment, I could almost feel him beside me, his steady presence urging me to stand tall. But the house was quiet, save for the faint hum of voices downstairs, Richard and Karen, moving through my home as if it were already theirs. I folded the deed, carefully tucked it back into the box, and made a decision. I wouldn't confront them, not yet. I'd watch, and find my way back to the woman I'd been before grief and neglect had worn me down. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory. I moved through the house like a guest, careful not to disturb the rhythm Richard and Karen had imposed. Karen had taken to rearranging things, my mother's china pushed to the back of the cupboard, her sleek glassware front and center, the living room curtains replaced with gauzy ones that let in too much light. Richard barely looked at me, his eyes always on his laptop searching for jobs or scrolling through listings for renovations they couldn't afford. I cooked meals they barely touched, cleared plates they left half-eaten, and swallowed the hurt each time Karen sighed at my presence, as if I were an inconvenience they hadn't yet solved. But beneath my quiet, something was stirring, a resolve I hadn't felt in years, a stubborn spark that refused to be snuffed out. I started spending more time outside, away from the suffocating air of the house. The backyard was my refuge, the swing Tom built still swaying gently in the breeze. I'd sit there, the ropes creaking under my weight, and let my mind wander to better days. I remembered the summer Richard turned 6, how he'd run through the sprinkler, his laughter echoing as Tom chased him with a hose. I'd watched from the porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, my heart so full it ached. Those were the years I'd felt most alive, most needed. Now as I swung gently, the memories were bittersweet, tinged with the realization that the boy I'd loved was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as a burden. The thought brought tears, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall, let them sink into the earth, a silent offering to the life I'd built and the woman I was still becoming. One afternoon, as I sat on the swing, a shadow fell across the grass. I looked up to see Mrs. Larson, my neighbor, leaning over the low fence that separated our yards. She was in her late 70s, her hair a soft white cloud, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched around them. "Clara, you look like you're carrying the world," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I managed a small smile, brushing off her concern, but she wasn't fooled. Mrs. Larson had known me since Richard was in diapers, had brought casseroles when Tom died, had sat with me on nights when the loneliness was too much. She tilted her head, studying me. "Come over for tea," she said. "No excuses." I hesitated, glancing back at the house, but something in her gaze, a quiet strength, pulled me to my feet. Her kitchen smelled of chamomile and fresh-baked scones, the kind of comfort that wraps around you like a warm shawl. We sat at her small table, the one her late husband had carved, and she poured tea into delicate cups, the steam curling between us. I don't know why, but the words spilled out Richard's demand, Karen's coldness, the way my home no longer felt like mine. My voice broke as I spoke, and I stared at the table, ashamed of my tears. Mrs. Larson reached across her hand, soft but steady on mine. "Clara," she said, "you've spent your life giving. But love doesn't mean letting people walk over you. You're stronger than you know." Her words landed like seeds in parched soil, stirring something deep within me. I thought of the deed, of Tom's belief in me, of my mother's unyielding spirit. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. That evening, I did something small but deliberate. I went to the living room where Karen had stacked my old photo albums in a corner, replaced by her collection of scented candles. I pulled the albums out, dusted them off, and carried them to my room. I sat on my bed, the lamp casting a warm glow, and opened the first one. There was Richard at 3, his cheeks smeared with chocolate from his birthday cake, his eyes bright with joy. There was Tom standing by the swing. He'd built his arm around me, both of us laughing. There was my mother, her hands busy with her quilting, her smile quiet but fierce. Page by page, I traced the life I'd lived, the love I'd given, the strength I'd shown. I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was Clara, a woman who'd faced loss and kept going, who'd built a home with her own hands and heart. I closed the album, my chest tight but lighter, and made a promise to myself I wouldn't let them take that from me. The next morning, I started moving differently. I stopped tiptoeing, stopped apologizing for existing in my own space. When Karen left dishes in the sink, I didn't wash them. When Richard grunted at me, I met his eyes holding his gaze until he looked away. They didn't notice at first, too caught up in their plans. Blueprints spread on the dining table, talk of knocking down walls, of turning my home into something sleek and modern. But I was watching, listening, gathering my strength like stones for a foundation. I began making phone calls, quiet ones from the backyard, to old friends, to the lawyer who'd handled Tom's estate. I wasn't sure what I was building, not yet, but I knew I needed to be ready. One day, as I was pruning the roses I'd planted for Karen, a young woman approached the front gate. She was in her 30s, her hair pulled back, her eyes kind but professional. "Mrs. Thompson," she asked, holding a clipboard. "I'm Emily from the community center. We're starting a gardening club, and Mrs. Larson said you might be interested." I blinked, caught off guard. Mrs. Larson's doing, no doubt. I almost said no, the weight of the house and my son's words still heavy on me. But Emily's smile was warm, and I found myself nodding. Sure, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'll come." The gardening club met twice a week in a small greenhouse behind the community center, its glass walls fogged with warmth and the scent of earth. There were 8 of us, mostly women my age, though Emily led with an energy that made the space feel alive. We planted bulbs, traded tips on soil, laughed over stories of stubborn weeds and runaway vines. For the first time in months, I felt seen not as Richard's mother or Karen's inconvenience, but as Clara, a woman with stories and skills whose hands could coax life from the ground. Emily would sit beside me, asking about my roses, listening as I spoke of Tom's love for the land of the swing he'd built. She didn't rush me or look away, and her attention was a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. One afternoon, as we potted tulip bulbs, Emily handed me a small packet of seeds labeled forget-me-nots. "For your garden," she said, her eyes soft. "They're tough like you." I held the packet, the tiny seeds rattling inside, and felt a lump in my throat. Tough. The word settled into me, a reminder of who I'd been, who I could still be. I thanked her, my voice catching, and that night I planted the seeds by the swing, pressing them into the soil with a prayer, not for Richard or Karen, but for myself, for the strength to reclaim what was mine. But back at the house, the tension was growing. Richard and Karen were bolder now, their voices louder as they discussed their plans. I overheard Karen on the phone talking about when the house is ours, and Richard mentioning a realtor who could appraise the property. They didn't bother lowering their voices anymore, as if I were already gone. But I wasn't. I was still here, waking each morning with a quiet purpose. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down every slight, every plan they made, every time they treated my home like a prize they'd won. It wasn't about revenge, not yet, but about remembering, about holding on to the truth of what was happening. One evening, as I sat on the swing, the forget-me-not seeds still fresh in the earth, Mrs. Larson came by again. She didn't say much, just handed me a small leather-bound book. My mother's journal, she said. She wrote it when she was your age, when the world tried to tell her she was done. I took it, the leather soft under my fingers, and thanked her. That night, I read it page after page of a woman who'd faced betrayal, who'd been dismissed, but who'd found her way back to herself through small, deliberate acts. Her words were a mirror reflecting my own heart, and I fell asleep with the book on my chest, feeling less alone. The Gardening Club. Mrs. Larson's quiet wisdom, the journal, they were threads weaving together a new version of me. I wasn't the woman who'd cried in the dark a month ago. I was still Clara, but stronger, surer, like a tree that bends in the storm but doesn't break. I looked at the house, at the life I'd built, and knew I wouldn't let it slip away. The deed was my anchor, but it was only the beginning. I had more to do, more to prove, not to Richard or Karen, but to myself. The days began to blur into a rhythm of quiet defiance. Each morning I woke with the dawn, the soft light filtering through the guest room's thin curtains, and felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. The house, once my sanctuary, had become a battlefield, but I was learning to navigate it with a new kind of strength, not loud or confrontational, but deep, like the roots of an old oak. Richard and Karen continued their campaign, their voices carrying through the walls, their plans for my home growing bolder. They spoke of new flooring, of tearing out the kitchen I'd loved for decades, of turning the backyard into a patio for parties they'd never invite me to. I listened, my notebook filling with their words, each one a stone added to the weight of their betrayal. But I didn't crumble. I was done crumbling. I started reclaiming small pieces of my space-subtle acts that felt like planting flags in my own territory. I moved my mother's china back to the front of the cupboard, stacking Karen's glassware in a box under the sink. I hung the old curtains again, the ones with the tiny embroidered roses, letting their familiar weight soften the living room's harsh light. Karen noticed her lips pursing as she passed by, but she said nothing, and that silence was a victory. Richard, too, seemed to sense a shift, his eyes lingering on me longer than usual, as if trying to read a book he'd long since closed. I met his gaze, my own steady, and watched him look away. These were small battles, but they mattered. They reminded me I was still here, still Clara, still the woman who'd built this life. The gardening club became my lifeline, a place where I could breathe without the weight of Richard's disdain or Karen's calculated smiles. The greenhouse was a world of its own, warm and alive, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and blooming flowers. Emily, with her quick laugh and gentle questions, had a way of making me feel seen not as a mother or a widow, but as a woman with stories worth hearing. The other women in the group, Lila, who'd lost her husband to cancer, Marie, whose children rarely called, shared their own quiet struggles, and in their company, I found a kinship I hadn't realized I needed. We'd sit around a rickety table, our hands dusted with earth-swapping tales of stubborn plants and stubborn hearts. Lila told me once, her voice soft, "You're like my roses, Clara. They look delicate, but they've got thorns." I smiled, the words settling into me, a reminder of the strength I was rediscovering. One afternoon, as we repotted ferns, Emily handed me a small clay pot painted with blue forget-me-nots. "For your swing," she said, her eyes warm, "something to remind you of home." I held the pot, its weight solid in my hands, and felt a rush of gratitude so sharp it brought tears. Home. The word had felt so distant, but here in this greenhouse with these women, I was starting to find it again, not just in the house, but in myself. That evening, I hung the pot from the swing's frame, its bright flowers catching the last light of day. I sat there swaying gently and thought of Tom, of how he'd love this yard, how he'd kneel in the dirt beside me, planting bulbs with a care that felt like love. I missed him not just as a husband, but as a witness to my life, someone who'd seen my worth when I couldn't. but I was learning to see it myself now, and that was enough. Mrs. Larson's visits became more frequent, her presence a steady anchor. She'd bring jars of homemade jam or clippings from her garden, but mostly she brought her stories, each one a lesson in resilience. One evening, as we sat on her porch, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine, she told me about her own son who'd tried to sell her house out from under her years ago. I didn't fight him with words, she said, her eyes glinting. I fought him with truth. Papers, Clara. They speak louder than tears. Her words echoed in me, a reminder of the deed in the attic of the power I held. I told her about it. My voice low, and she nodded, a small smile creasing her face. You're waking up, she said. Don't stop now. I walked home that night, the stars bright above, feeling a fire kindling inside me, not wild or destructive, but steady like a hearth that could warm a home. I began to take bolder steps, ones that reached beyond the house. I called my old friend Susan, who'd moved to a nearby town after her kids left home. We'd lost touch over the years, but her voice on the phone was as warm as ever, pulling me back to the days we'd spent laughing over coffee, sharing dreams and fears. I told her everything, Richard's words, Karen's coldness, the way my home felt like a prison. She listened, her silence full of understanding, and then said, Clara, you're not alone. Come visit. Let me remind you who you are. I hesitated, the idea of leaving the house even for a day, feeling reckless. But the next weekend, I drove the hour to her cottage, my hands tight on the wheel, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. Susan's home was small but bright, filled with books and paintings, the kind of place that felt like a hug. We sat in her garden sipping tea, the air alive with the hum of bees and the scent of lavender. She didn't let me hide, asking questions that cut through my defenses, drawing out the pain I'd buried. I cried as I spoke, not just for Richard's betrayal, but for the years I'd spent shrinking myself, believing my worth lay in what I could give others. Susan took my hand, her grip firm. You're not done, Clara, she said. You're just beginning again. She gave me a notebook, its cover embossed with a single word, courage. Write your story, she said. Not for them, but for you. I drove home that night, the notebook on the passenger seat, feeling lighter, like I'd left some of my grief behind in her garden. Back at the house, I started writing. Late at night, when Richard and Karen were asleep, I'd sit at the small desk in my room, the lamp casting a soft circle of light, and pour my heart onto the pages. I wrote about Tom, about the way his laugh could fill a room, about the nights we'd danced in the kitchen to old records. I wrote about Richard as a boy, his small hand in mine, his dreams so big they scared me. I wrote about my mother, her hands steady as she stitched her quilts, her voice teaching me to stand tall. And I wrote about myself, the woman I'd been, the woman I was becoming. The act of writing was a reclamation, a way of stitching myself back together, thread by thread. I also started planning quietly, methodically. I called the lawyer again, asking questions about property rights, about deeds, about what it meant to hold a home in my name. His voice was calm, professional, but kind, and he promised to review the documents if I needed him. I contacted the bank, checking on accounts Tom and I had set up years ago, small savings we'd tucked away for emergencies. The balance was modest, but enough to give me options, to remind me I wasn't as powerless as Richard and Karen believed. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mrs. Larson, but each step felt like a brick, laid in a new foundation, one that would hold me up when the time came. The gardening club gave me another unexpected gift. One day, Emily announced a community project. We'd be planting a memory garden at the local park, a place for people to honor loved ones. She asked if I'd lead a small group, saying my roses had inspired her. I was stunned, my first instinct to say no, but the women around the table nodded, their eyes full of trust. So I said yes, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something new. We spent weeks planning, choosing plants, sketching layouts. I poured myself into it, my hands in the dirt, my heart in the work. The forget-me-nots I'd planted by the swing were sprouting now, tiny blue blooms that caught the light, and I decided to include them in the garden, a quiet tribute to Tom, to my mother, to the Clara I was rediscovering. At home, the air grew heavier. Richard and Karen were moving faster, now their plans no longer whispered. I found a realtor's card on the kitchen counter, saw emails on Richard's open laptop about appraisals. They were counting on me to bend, to fade away quietly, but they didn't know the woman I was becoming. I kept the deed close, locked in the attic, and carried its truth like a shield. I wasn't ready to show it, not yet, but I felt its weight, its promise. I was Clara, and this was my home, my story, my strength. I'd given Richard everything, but I wouldn't give him this. Not without a fight. The Memory Garden Project became my anchor, a place where I could pour my energy and find purpose beyond the walls of a house that no longer felt like mine. Each morning I'd wake before Richard and Karen slipping out to the park where the garden was taking shape. The air was cool, the grass still damp with dew, and the quiet was a balm to my frayed nerves. We'd chosen a small clearing near a willow tree, its branches swaying like a gentle curtain, and there, with Lila Marie and the others, I'd kneel in the dirt planting forget-me-nots, lavender, and hardy roses that could weather any storm. My hands, once rough from years of work, felt alive again, the soil soft and forgiving under my fingers. Emily would join us, her laughter bright as she hauled bags of mulch or teased me about my meticulous rows. "You're an artist, Clara," she'd say, and I'd blush, unused to praise but hungry for it. The garden was more than plants. It was a testament to survival, to the things we hold on to when the world tries to take everything else. I named my section of the garden Clara's Corner, a quiet claim to something that was mine alone. I'd carved a small wooden sign with the name "My Hand Steady" as I etched each letter. And when I planted it among the forget-me-nots, the group clapped their smiles, warm and genuine. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, not as Richard's mother or Tom's widow, but as Clara, a woman whose hands could create beauty, whose heart could still dream. Lila pulled me aside one day, her eyes soft. "This garden's like you," she said. "It's been through hard seasons, but it's blooming anyway." Her words sank deep, rooting themselves in the part of me that was learning to stand tall again. Back at the house, the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing day. Richard and Karen were no longer subtle. They'd invited a contractor over, a brusque man in a polo shirt who walked through my home with a tape measure, talking loudly about opening up the space and maximizing value. I stood in the kitchen, invisible to them, as they discussed tearing out the counter where I'd taught Richard to make pancakes, where Tom and I had shared late-night coffee. Karen's voice was bright, almost giddy, as she pointed to the walls I'd painted, saying they'd look better in something neutral modern. Richard nodded, his face unreadable, and I felt a pang, not just for the house, but for the boy I'd lost, the one who'd once run to me with every triumph and hurt. I didn't speak, didn't let them see the storm inside me. Instead, I slipped out to the swing, the clay pot of forget-me-nots swaying above me, and breathed until the ache eased. I was changing, and they didn't see it. I'd stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for my presence. I'd sit at the dining table with my notebook writing under their noses, my pen moving steadily as I recorded their plans, their slights, their casual cruelty. I'd cook only for myself now, simple meals, soup, cornbread, things that filled the kitchen with the sense of my childhood. Karen would wrinkle her nose, muttering about heavy food, but I'd eat slowly, savoring each bite, reclaiming the table as mine. Richard noticed his brow furrowing, but he didn't say anything. I think he sensed the shift, the way I carried myself with a quiet certainty, but he didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't the mother he'd dismissed, not anymore. Susan's notebook was filling up its pages, a map of my heart. I wrote about the garden, about the women who'd become my unexpected family, about the swing where I'd cried and dreamed. I wrote about Tom, how he'd hum while fixing the porch steps, how his love had been a steady hand on my back. I wrote about my mother, her voice sharp with wisdom, telling me to hold my head high even when the world pushed me down. And I wrote about Richard not with anger, but with grief, mourning the boy who'd once needed me, and the man who'd forgotten how to love me. Writing was my rebellion, a way of claiming my story when Richard and Karen were trying to rewrite it. Each word was a step toward the woman I was becoming, one who could face betrayal and still stand whole. I started making bigger moves, ones that reached beyond the house and the garden. I visited the lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, in his small office downtown, the deed tucked safely in my purse. He was older than I remembered, his hair white, but his eyes sharp, and he listened as I explained everything: Richard's demand, Karen's scheming, the realtor's card I'd found. He studied the deed, his fingers tracing the names mine, and Tom's then looked at me with a quiet respect. "This is ironclad, Clara," he said. "The house is yours, and no one can take it unless you let them." He offered to draft a letter, a formal notice to Richard and Karen, but I shook my head. I wasn't ready for that, not yet. I needed time to build my strength to be sure of my next step, but I left his office with a weight lifted, the deed's truth, a shield I carried close. I also went to the bank, sitting across from a young teller who pulled up the accounts Tom and I had opened decades ago. There was more than I'd expected, not a fortune, but enough to give me freedom to let me choose my future. I transferred the funds to a new account, one in my name alone, and felt a rush of power, not loud or boastful, but steady, like the pulse of the earth. I didn't tell anyone, not even Susan or Mrs. Larson, but the knowledge was a spark lighting the path ahead. I began to think about what I wanted, not just to keep the house, but to live a life that was mine, one where I wasn't defined by what I'd lost or what others took. The gardening club gave me another chance to grow. Emily asked me to speak at the garden's dedication ceremony, a small event to unveil Clara's corner and the other sections. I froze my first instinct to say no, but her eyes were so full of belief that I nodded, my heart racing. I spent nights writing the speech, my words clumsy at first, then clearer, stronger. I wrote about memory, about the people we carry in our hearts, about the gardens we plant to keep them close. I wrote about resilience, about blooming even after the hardest winters. When the day came, I stood in front of a small crowd, Emily, Lila Marie, Mrs. Larson, and strangers from the community, my voice trembling but steady. I spoke of Tom, of my mother, of the forget-me-nots that grew despite neglect. I didn't mention Richard or Karen, but I felt their shadow in every word, a reminder of why I was fighting. When I finished, the applause was soft but warm, and Emily hugged me, whispering, "You were incredible, Clara." I cried then, not from sadness, but from pride, from the realization that I was more than the woman they'd tried to erase. At home, I began to act with purpose. I sorted through the attic, pulling out boxes I'd ignored for years. Tom's tools, my mother's quilts, letters we'd written to each other when we were young. I kept what mattered, donating the rest to the community center, a quiet letting go that felt like freedom. I wore Tom's old watch, its leather band worn but warm against my wrist, a reminder of his strength and mine. I planted more forget-me-nots around the swing, their blue blooms a promise to myself. Each act was a stitch, mending the tears in my heart, building a Clara who could face what was coming. Richard and Karen were moving faster now, their confidence growing. I found a contract on the dining table, a proposal to sell the house once it was transferred to them. They'd stopped pretending, their voices loud as they discussed timelines, profits, a new life built on my loss. But I was ready, or nearly so. I kept the deed close, its weight a constant reminder, and I watched them, my silence, not weakness but strategy. I thought of Mrs. Larson's mother, of the journal that spoke of truth over tears. I thought of Susan's notebook, of the courage I was writing into being. I thought of the garden of Clara's corner where my hands had created something lasting. I was no longer the woman who'd wept in the dark. I was Clara, and I was ready to reclaim my home, my life, my worth. The dedication of Clara's corner marked a turning point, like a page turning in a book I'd been writing without realizing it. Standing there under the willow tree with the scent of lavender and fresh earth around me, I felt a strength I hadn't known I still possessed. The crowd's applause lingered in my ears as I walked home that evening, the small wooden sign, Clara's Corner, etched in my mind, a symbol of something I'd built that no one could take. But the house, when I stepped inside, was a stark reminder of the battle still ahead. Richard and Karen's voices carried from the living room, their laughter sharp discussing paint swatches for walls they hadn't yet claimed. I paused in the hallway, my hand on the banister, and felt the deed's weight in my heart, even though it was locked away upstairs. I wasn't ready to show it, not yet, but every day brought me closer, every choice a step toward the moment I'd stand my ground. I began to move with a quiet purpose that felt almost sacred. The house was still a minefield, but I navigated it differently now, my steps sure, my presence unapologetic. I stopped cooking for them entirely, letting Karen's complaints about nothing to eat hang unanswered in the air. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, my mother's quilt draped over the chair, and eat my meals simple, hearty things like potato soup or biscuits I'd baked from her recipe. The act was defiant, a reclaiming of space, and I savored the silence that followed the way Richard's eyes flicked to me uncertain before he turned away. Karen tried to push back once, slamming a cabinet door and muttering about my selfishness, but I looked at her, my gaze steady, and said, "This is my kitchen, Karen." The words were soft, but they landed like stones, and she didn't respond, her face tightening as she walked out. It was a small victory, but it fueled me a spark growing into a flame. The gardening club continued to be my refuge, a place where I could shed the weight of the house and simply be. Emily had started calling me the Rose Whisperer, a nickname that made the others laugh, but filled me with a quiet pride. We were planning a spring festival now, a celebration of the memory garden, and Emily asked me to lead a workshop on planting resilient flowers, roses, forget-me-nots, anything that could thrive through neglect. I hesitated, my old fears whispering I wasn't enough, but Lila and Marie were there, their nods encouraging, and I said yes. Preparing for the workshop meant hours in the greenhouse sketching plans, testing soil, learning more about the plants I loved. It was work, but it didn't feel like labor. It felt like joy, like rediscovering a part of myself I'd buried under years of giving. One afternoon, as we sorted seeds, Lila shared a story about her own daughter who'd stopped speaking to her after a fight over money. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet, and I reached for her hand the way Mrs. Larson had reached for mine. "They think we're done, don't they?" Lila said, her smile bitter. "Like we stop mattering when our hair goes gray." I nodded, thinking of Richard, of the way he'd looked through me, as if I were already a memory. "We're not done," I said, my voice firm. "We're just beginning." The words surprised me, their strength echoing in the greenhouse, and Lila squeezed my hand, her smile softening. That moment bound us closer, a silent pact among women who'd been dismissed, but were blooming anyway. Susan called me one evening, her voice bright through the phone. She'd heard about Clara's Corner from a mutual friend and insisted on visiting for the festival. "I'm proud of you, Clara," she said, and I could hear the smile in her words. "You're finding your way." I invited her to stay at the house, a decision I made without hesitation, knowing it would unsettle Richard and Karen. When I told them, Karen's face soured and Richard muttered about space, but I didn't back down. "Susan's my friend," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "She's welcome here." They didn't push, and I felt another piece of myself slide back into place, the woman who'd once hosted book clubs and dinner parties, who'd filled this house with laughter and love. I started sorting through more than just the attic now. I was sorting through my life. I found an old jewelry box in the guest room closet one Tom had given me on our 10th anniversary. Inside was a silver locket, simple but heavy, with a tiny photo of us on our wedding day. I hadn't worn it in years, afraid it would break, but I clasped it around my neck, now the metal cool against my skin. It was a reminder of love, yes, but also of my own resilience, of the promises I'd kept to myself. I wore it every day, its weight a comfort, a silent vow to honor the woman I was becoming. I also pulled out my mother's recipe book. Its pages yellowed her handwriting, looping across them. I baked her apple pie one Sunday, the scent filling the house, and when Karen reached for a slice, I handed her a plate but said, "This is for me and Susan." Her eyes narrowed, but I didn't flinch, and the pie tasted sweeter for it. My notebook grew thicker, its pages a tapestry of my heart. I wrote about the garden, about the locket, about the way the swing creaked under me as I dreamed. I wrote about Richard, not with the grief of before, but with a clarity that hurt less and revealed more. He was my son, but he was also a man who'd chosen his path, who'd traded love for ambition. I wrote about Karen, her coldness, a mirror of her own insecurities, and found I pitied her, a feeling that surprised me with its calm. Writing was my anchor, grounding me as I planned my next steps. I met with Mr. Hargrove again, bringing the deed and a list of questions. He walked me through my rights, his voice steady, and suggested I consider a will, something to protect the house beyond my lifetime. I nodded the idea, both heavy and liberating, a way to ensure my legacy wouldn't be erased. The bank account was another step. I'd opened a new one, but now I moved more stocks Tom had invested in a small inheritance from my mother I'd forgotten about. The teller, a kind woman named Rachel, helped me set up online access, her fingers quick on the keyboard. "You're taking charge," she said, smiling, and I felt a rush of pride. I wasn't rich, but I had enough to choose my future, to walk away if I wanted, or to fight for what was mine. I chose to fight not with shouts or tears, but with the quiet power of truth. I began to think about the house differently, not just as a home, but as a symbol of my life, one I could shape however I chose. The spring festival was approaching, and with it a chance to show the world who I was. I practiced my workshop speech in front of the mirror, my voice growing stronger with each try. I wanted to talk about resilience, about the roses that bloomed despite drought, about the forget-me-nots that sprouted in forgotten corners. I wanted to tell the women who'd come women like Lila, like Marie, like me, that we weren't done, that our stories mattered. Susan arrived the day before, her suitcase small, but her presence big, filling the house with laughter I hadn't heard in years. She hugged me tight, whispering, "You're glowing, Clara." Richard and Karen kept their distance, their discomfort palpable, but I didn't care. Susan slept in the guest room with me, the two of us talking late into the night, her stories of her own reinvention a mirror to mine. At the festival, Clara's corner was a sea of blue and green, the forget-me-nots and roses swaying in the breeze. I stood in front of a small crowd, my locket warm against my chest, and spoke. My voice didn't shake this time. I talked about planting seeds in hard soil, about tending them through storms, about the beauty that comes from patience and faith. I saw Lila's eyes shine, Marie's nod, Emily's proud smile. When I finished, the applause was louder than at the dedication, and I felt something shift inside me, a certainty that I was enough, that I'd always been enough. Susan squeezed my hand, whispering, "That's my Clara," and I laughed a sound that felt like freedom. Back at the house, the contract I'd seen was gone, but the realtor's card was back tucked into a drawer. Richard and Karen were quieter now, their plans on hold, perhaps sensing the change in me. But I knew they wouldn't stop, not until I made them. I kept the deed close its truth, a heartbeat in my chest. I thought of the garden, of the locket, of the notebook filled with my story. I thought of Tom, of my mother, of the women who'd carried me through this season. I was ready not for revenge, but for justice, for the moment I'd show them who I was. I was Clara, and this was my home, my life, my time to bloom. The spring festival left a glow in me that didn't fade like sunlight lingering on the horizon after dusk. Clara's corner was no longer just a patch of earth. It was a testament to my resilience, a living reminder that I could create something beautiful, even in the hardest seasons. I carried that truth with me as I moved through the house, my steps lighter, my heart steadier. Richard and Karen were still there, their presence a constant pressure. But I no longer felt like a guest in my own home. I was the roots, the foundation, the heartbeat of this place, and no amount of their scheming could change that. The deed remained locked in the attic, its existence a quiet promise. But I was building more than a legal claim. I was building a life that was mine, one where I defined my worth. I began to act with a boldness that surprised even me. I redecorated the living room, not with Karen's stark modern tastes, but with pieces that told my story. I hung a quilt my mother had made its patchwork vibrant against the wall and set out framed photos Tom and me on our honeymoon, Richard as a toddler, my parents on their farm. Karen's candles were relegated to a box in the garage, and when she noticed her lips tightened, but she didn't dare comment. Richard, too, seemed unsettled, his eyes following me as I moved through the house, no longer tiptoeing, no longer invisible. I'd catch him watching me, a flicker of doubt in his expression, as if he were seeing me for the first time in years. I didn't confront him, didn't need to. My presence was enough a quiet declaration that I wasn't going anywhere. The gardening club was thriving, and with it, my sense of purpose. Emily had asked me to mentor new members women who'd joined after hearing about Clara's corner. I taught them how to prune roses, how to plant bulbs that would bloom year after year, how to trust the earth to hold their hopes. One woman, Sarah, was in her 60s, her hands trembling as she spoke of a daughter who'd cut her out after a divorce. I listened, my heart aching with recognition, and shared a piece of my own story, not all of it, but enough to let her know she wasn't alone. We keep growing, I told her, my voice soft but sure. No matter what they take, they can't take that. She nodded, her eyes bright with tears, and I felt a kinship deeper than words, a bond forged in the dirt, and the act of beginning again. Susan's visit had left a spark, and we talked often now, her calls a lifeline across the miles. She'd started a small art studio in her town, teaching painting to retirees, and her stories of women finding joy in their later years stirred something in me. "You could do something like that, Clara," she said one evening, her voice crackling through the phone. "The garden's just the start. What else do you love?" I thought about it sitting on the swing with the forget-me-nots blooming around me. I loved stories, writing them, telling them, hearing them. I loved the way a quilt could hold a family's history, the way a recipe could carry a memory. I wasn't sure what shape it would take, but I began to dream of something new, something that was mine alone. I started small, teaching a storytelling workshop at the community center, an idea Emily had suggested after hearing me speak at the festival. It was just a handful of people at first, Lila Marie, a few others from the gardening club, but it grew word spreading about the woman who could weave a tale that made you laugh and cry in the same breath. I'd sit in a circle of folding chairs, the room smelling of coffee and old books, and share stories from my life. Tom's proposal under a harvest moon, my mother's lessons in resilience the day Richard built a birdhouse with his small, clumsy hands. I encouraged the others to share too, and their voices, halting at first, then stronger, filled the room with lives that had been overlooked but never diminished. Each session was a reclamation, a reminder that our stories mattered, that we mattered. At home, I was rewriting my own story in other ways. I met with Mr. Hargrove again this time to draft a will. It wasn't about punishing Richard, though the thought of his betrayal still stung. It was about protecting what I'd built, ensuring the house and its memories would go to someone who'd cherish them. I considered the community center, the gardening club, even Emily, whose kindness had helped me find my way. I didn't finalize anything, but the act of planning felt like a gift to myself, a way of saying my life was mine to shape. I also opened a separate savings account, funneling small amounts from the joint accounts Tom and I had kept. It wasn't much, but it was a safety net, a reminder that I could walk away if I chose or stay and fight with the strength I'd earned. I began to wear my history like armor. I pulled out Tom's old flannel shirt, one I'd kept in a drawer, and wore it while gardening its sleeves, rolled up its scent of cedar and memory wrapping around me. I polished my mother's silver teapot, using it every morning, its shine a quiet defiance against Karen's sleek appliances. I even started playing music again, the old records Tom and I had danced to Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, letting their voices fill the house. Karen complained once, saying it was too loud, but I smiled and turned the volume up, swaying in the kitchen as I chopped vegetables for my own dinner. Richard watched, his face unreadable, and I wondered if he remembered the nights we'd danced together, him standing on my feet, giggling as we spun. The memory hurt, but it also strengthened me, a reminder of what I'd given and what I still had. The gardening club gave me another chance to shine. Emily organized a fundraiser for the memory garden, a chance to expand it with a small fountain and benches. She asked me to lead the effort, saying my story had inspired donors. I was nervous, unused to asking for money, but I said yes, driven by the thought of Clara's Corner growing, of leaving a legacy that wasn't tied to Richard or Karen. I wrote letters, made calls, even spoke at a town meeting, my voice steady as I talked about the garden's meaning, memory, resilience community. People listened, their faces softening, and by the end we'd raised enough for the fountain and more. At the celebration, Emily unveiled a plaque for Clara's Corner, my name carved in elegant script, and I cried, not from sadness, but from the weight of being seen, of being valued. Back at the house, Richard and Karen were growing restless. I found more papers, loan applications, a letter from a developer interested in the property. They were moving forward, assuming I'd bend, that my silence meant surrender. But I was watching, waiting, my notebook filled with their plans, my heart filled with resolve. I thought of Mrs. Larson's mother, who'd fought with truth, not tears. I thought of Susan's courage, of Lila's roses, of the forget-me-nots blooming by the swing. I was ready not just to hold the deed, but to use it to show them the woman they'd underestimated. One evening, I did something symbolic, something for me. I took Tom's watch, the one I'd worn for weeks, and hung it on a small hook by the swing, letting it sway with the forget-me-nots. It wasn't about letting go of him, but about carrying his strength in a new way, about trusting myself to move forward. I sat there, the night air cool, and wrote in Susan's notebook the word courage, glowing on the cover. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, about the house I'd fight for, about the life I was claiming. The stars were bright above, and for the first time in years, I felt whole, not because of what I'd given others, but because of what I'd given myself. Richard and Karen were planning a meeting with the developer, their voices loud as they discussed dates, profits, a future that didn't include me. I listened from the hallway, my heart steady, my resolve unshaken. The deed was my trump card, but it was only part of the story. I was Clara, the woman who'd planted a garden, who'd told stories, who'd built a life from love and loss. I was ready to show them, not with anger, but with the quiet power of truth, that this was my home, my life, my time to stand tall. The air in the house had changed, charged with an unspoken reckoning that I could feel in my bones. Richard and Karen moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, their plans for my home no longer whispered but laid bare. The developer's letter was pinned to the fridge, now a brazen declaration of their intent, and they spoke openly about Timeline's renovations and the new start they'd build on the ashes of my life. I watched them, my silence not surrender, but a gathering of strength, like a river carving its path before it breaks through stone. The deed was still locked in the attic, its truth a steady pulse in my chest, but it was more than a piece of paper. Now it was a symbol of everything I'd reclaimed, of the woman I'd become. I was ready not for a fight that would leave scars, but for a moment of truth that would shift the ground beneath them. The gardening club had given me a community, a purpose, but it also gave me clarity. As I knelt in Clara's corner tending the roses and forget-me-nots, I saw my life reflected in the earth seasons of drought and bloom of neglect and renewal. I'd survived the hard seasons, and I was blooming now not because of Richard or Karen, but in spite of them. Emily noticed the change, her eyes soft, as she handed me a new packet of seeds one morning. For next year, she said, her smile warm, something to look forward to. I took the seeds their weight, a promise, and felt a surge of gratitude not just for her, but for Lila Marie, Susan Mrs. Larson, all the women who'd helped me see my own strength. They were my roots, holding me steady as I prepared to face what was coming. At home, I moved with a quiet authority that unsettled Richard and Karen, though they couldn't quite name why. I'd stopped hiding my presence, stopped letting their plans erase me. I played my records louder, danced in the kitchen to Ella Fitzgerald, my bare feet soft on the linoleum. I set the dining table with my mother's china every night, eating alone, but with a dignity that filled the room. Karen's complaints grew sharper, her voice tight as she muttered about clutter or noise, but I'd just smile, my gaze steady, and say, "This is my home, Karen. I like it this way." Richard's discomfort was subtler, his eyes darting to me when he thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of unease in his expression. I wondered if he sensed the truth, if some part of him remembered the mother who'd given him everything, but I didn't let myself dwell on it. My heart was no longer his to break. I'd been meeting with Mr. Hargrove regularly now, each visit a step toward solidifying my plan. He'd reviewed the deed, the accounts, the will I was drafting, and his calm assurance was a lifeline. "You're in control, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "When you're ready, they'll have no choice but to listen." I nodded, the weight of his words settling into me. I'd also been talking to Rachel at the bank, moving more funds, setting up alerts to track any attempts to access the old accounts. The money wasn't vast, but it was mine, a resource I could use to rebuild or to stand my ground. I began to think about the future, not just keeping the house, but what I wanted beyond it. The storytelling workshop was growing, and I dreamed of turning it into something more, a book perhaps, or a series of classes, a way to share the stories of women like me whose voices had been silenced but never lost. Susan's encouragement fueled those dreams. She'd started sending me articles about women starting businesses in their 60s, about authors publishing their first books later in life. "You're a storyteller, Clara," she said during one of our calls, her voice bright with belief. "The world needs your voice." Oh, I'd laugh, brushing off her enthusiasm, but her words took root, mingling with the seeds Emily had given me, with the stories I told at the community center. I began to write more, not just in the notebook, but on a small laptop I'd bought with my savings, a quiet investment in myself. I wrote about the garden, about the swing, about the locket that still hung around my neck. I wrote about resilience, about the quiet power of standing up for yourself, about the beauty of a life reclaimed. Each word was a brick, building a future I could see clearly now, one where I wasn't defined by loss, but by what I created. The moment of truth came sooner than I'd expected. It was a Saturday, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and Richard had invited the developer to the house. I'd overheard them planning it, their voices loud as they discussed finalizing details. The developer, a man named Mr. Caldwell, arrived in a sleek black car, his suit, crisp, his handshake firm as Richard greeted him at the door. Karen was all smiles, offering coffee, her voice sugary as she led him through the house, pointing out walls they'd tear down, spaces they'd modernize. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening as they moved from room to room, their laughter grating against my nerves. They didn't invite me to join, didn't acknowledge me, but I felt no need to insert myself. I was waiting, my heart steady, my plan clear. When they reached the living room, Mr. Caldwell asked about the property's ownership, a question that made Richard pause. "It's in the family." he said, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. "We're handling the transition." Karen chimed in her tone. Bright. "Clara's ready to move on. She's agreed to sign it over." My breath caught, not from surprise, but from the audacity of their lie. I set my mug down the clink, loud in the quiet kitchen, and walked to the attic. My knees ached on the stairs, but my hands were steady as I unlocked the metal box and pulled out the deed, its paper crisp, my name and Tom's, bold in black ink. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its truth, then tucked it into my cardigan and walked downstairs. I stepped into the living room, my presence cutting through their conversation like a blade. Mr. Caldwell turned his smile polite but curious, while Richard's face tightened, Karen's eyes narrowing. Clara Richard said, his voice forced, "We're just discussing some plans." I nodded, my gaze steady, and looked at Mr. Caldwell. "I heard you ask about ownership," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I thought you should know the truth." I pulled the deed from my cardigan and held it out my hand, unwavering. "This is my house. My name is on the title, along with my late husband's. No one else has claim to it." The room went still, the air thick with shock. Mr. Caldwell took the deed, his eyes scanning the document, his professionalism masking any surprise. Richard's face flushed, his mouth opening, then closing, while Karen's smile froze, her hands clenching at her sides. Mom Richard started, his voice low, "This isn't the time." But I cut him off, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that silenced him. "It's exactly the time, Richard," I said. "You told me this was your house. You told me to leave. But this," I gestured to the deed now in Mr. Caldwell's hands, "says otherwise." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, handing the deed back to me. "Mrs. Thompson, it's clear you're the legal owner." He said, his tone neutral but firm. "Any plans would need your approval." He glanced at Richard and Karen, his expression unreadable, then thanked me and excused himself, saying he'd follow up later. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face was a storm of emotions, anger, shame, disbelief, while Karen's eyes darted between us, her composure cracking. I stood there, the deed in my hand, my locket warm against my chest, and felt a power I'd never known, not because I'd won, but because I'd stood up for myself. Richard found his voice first, his words sharp. "You're making a mistake, Mom," he said. "We were trying to help you to make things easier." Karen nodded, her voice shrill. "You can't keep up with this place, Clara. You're being selfish." I looked at them, my son and his wife, and felt a pang not for their words, but for the distance between us, for the love I'd poured into him that he'd chosen to discard. "Selfish." I said softly the word heavy. "I gave you everything, Richard. This house, my time, my heart. And you told me to leave." My voice didn't waver, didn't break. "This is my home. If you can't respect that, you know where the door is." I turned and walked to the kitchen, the deed still in my hand, my heart pounding but steady. Behind me, I heard Karen's sharp whisper, Richard's low response, but I didn't look back. I sat at the table, my mother's quilt over the chair, and sipped my tea, the steam curling in the air. The house was quiet now, but it felt different, mine again, not because of the deed, but because I'd claimed it with my voice, my truth. I thought of Clara's corner, of the forget-me-nots, of the stories I'd told, and the ones I'd yet to write. I thought of Tom, of my mother, of the women who'd carried me here. I was Clara, and I was enough. The days after the confrontation felt like the calm after a storm, the air clear but heavy with what had passed. The house was quieter now. Richard and Karen's voices subdued their plans, unraveling like a poorly knit sweater. They stayed, but their presence was different, tentative, as if they were guests who'd overstayed their welcome. I moved through my home with a newfound ease, my steps, sure, my heart steady. The deed was back in the attic, locked safely away, but its truth lived in me now, a quiet strength that no one could take. I'd shown them who I was not with anger or vengeance, but with a dignity that silenced their assumptions. And in that silence, I found peace, not because they'd changed, but because I had. I spent more time in Clara's corner, the garden a sanctuary where I could breathe freely. The forget-me-nots were thriving their blue blooms, a delicate defiance against the autumn chill, and the roses stood tall, their petals soft but resilient. Emily and the others noticed the change in me, their smiles warm as we worked side by side planning for the garden's winter preparations. Lila pulled me aside one morning, her hands dusted with soil, and said, "You're different, Clara, like you've found your light again." I smiled the words settling into me and told her about the deed, about the moment I'd stood up. Her eyes shone, and she hugged me, her embrace fierce. "That's my girl," she whispered, and I laughed a sound that felt like freedom. The storytelling workshop had grown too, the room now filled with faces I hadn't seen before, women and a few men, all drawn by word of mouth. I'd started calling it the Memory Circle, a name that felt right for the stories we shared, each one a thread weaving us together. I told them about my mother's quilts, about Tom's swing, about the day I'd planted forget-me-nots, and promised myself I'd keep going. I listened as they shared their own tales of lost loves of children who drifted of dreams they'd buried but were ready to unearth. One woman, Ellen, spoke of her father's farm sold against her wishes, and I saw my own pain in her eyes. I took her hand after the session, my voice soft. "Your story isn't over," I said. "You get to write the next chapter." She nodded, tears falling, and I felt a purpose deeper than I'd ever known, a calling to help others find their voices as I'd found mine. Susan visited again this time for a weekend, her laughter filling the house like music. She'd brought a canvas, insisting we paint together, and we set up in the backyard, the swing swaying nearby. I was clumsy with the brush, but she guided me, her patience endless, and by the end we'd created a messy, vibrant picture of Clara's corner, the blues and greens blending into something alive. "This is you," she said, pointing to the canvas. Colorful, strong, still growing. We hung it in the living room over the quilt, and when Karen passed by, her lips pursed. I didn't care. This was my home, my story, and I was done hiding it. Richard and Karen were packing, though they hadn't said it outright. I'd see boxes in the master bedroom, Karen's clothes folded neatly, Richard's books stacked by the door. They avoided me. Their conversations hushed their eyes, darting away when I entered a room. I didn't ask where they were going, didn't need to. The sheriff hadn't been necessary, not in the way I'd once imagined, but the thread of truth had been enough. Mr. Hargrove had sent a letter at my request, a formal reminder of my ownership, and I'd left it on the kitchen counter for them to find. They'd read it, their faces pale, and the next day the developer's calls stopped. I felt no triumph, only a quiet relief, like setting down a burden I'd carried too long. One evening, Richard came to me, his face drawn, his hands fidgeting. We were in the kitchen, the lights soft, the scent of my mother's apple pie lingering from dinner. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at him. My son, the boy I'd loved through every fever and dream, and saw a man struggling with his own regrets. I waited, letting his words hang, giving him space to say more. I thought it was best for you," he said, his eyes dropping. I was wrong. The apology was halting, incomplete, but it was there, and I felt a pang, not of forgiveness, not yet, but of understanding. He was my son, but he was also human, flawed, shaped by choices I couldn't control. I nodded, my voice steady. "This is my home, Richard," I said. "I built it with your father, with love. You forgot that, but I didn't." He flinched, but I didn't soften my words. "I hope you find what you're looking for." I added softer now, "but it won't be here." He stood there silent, then nodded and walked away. The next morning I saw him packing his car, Karen beside him, their movements quick, their faces closed. I watched from the porch, my locket warm against my chest, and felt no anger, only a quiet peace. They drove away, the car's engine fading, and the house was mine again, not just in name, but in spirit. I finalized the will with Mr. Hargrove leaving the house to the community center with a trust to maintain Clara's corner and the memory circle. It wasn't about cutting Richard out, but about honoring what mattered: community stories, resilience. I kept writing my laptop filled with pages that might one day be a book, a collection of stories from the women I'd met, their voices woven with mine. I taught more workshops, planted more seeds, danced to Ella Fitzgerald in my kitchen. The swing became my evening ritual, the forget-me-nots, and Tom's watch swaying above me, their presence a reminder of love that endured. One afternoon, I did something small but profound. I took a cutting from the roses in Clara's corner and planted it by the swing next to the forget-me-nots. It was a gesture, a way of tying the garden to my home, of carrying its strength with me. I sat there, the earth cool under my hands, and thought of my mother, her quilt stitched with love, of Tom, his laughter echoing in the yard, of the women who'd helped me bloom. I thought of Richard not with pain, but with a quiet hope that he'd find his way. I didn't need his love to be whole, I had my own, and it was enough. As the sun set, painting the sky in pinks and golds, I opened Susan's notebook, the word courage worn, but bright. I wrote one last line, my pen steady. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. I closed the notebook, my heart full, and looked at the roses, the swing, the house that was mine. I was Clara, and I was at peace, not because the fight was over, but because I'd found the strength to live my truth, to bloom where I was planted, to write a story that was wholly beautifully mine,